Tonight we'll be talking about Michigan's own polar bear soldiers. Most of us learned in school that the war to end all wars, World War I, ended in the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month of November 1918, just coming up in a very short period, less than a month. But yet there were 5,000 soldiers, 90% of them, 90%, Mike? About that, from the state of Michigan that went to Russia to fight the Bolsheviks. And so Mike will be talking about that tonight. 56 of them, of the remains of them, of the American Expeditionary Force, are buried in plots surrounding the Polar Bear Memorial at Whitechapel Cemetery, which Mike will be talking about. Our presenter tonight is a grandson of a polar bear and president of the Polar Bear Memorial Association. He will draw on the experiences of his grandfather and other veterans of the campaign, including Harry Meade, father of Grosse Pointer Hudson Meade. And Priscilla is here tonight, if you don't mind me mentioning. Priscilla Meade, Hudson's daughter. Hudson was a presenter for the Historical Society, too. Mike is a graduate of GMI, what is now Kettering University in Flint, a mechanical engineering degree, 31 years with General Motors, and a Master's of Science in Industrial Engineering at Wayne State University. Mike Grobbel, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to tell you a story tonight. It's not taught in schools, at least not here in the U.S. It was taught in Russia. It's about a little known and obscure military intervention that occurred in the late days of World War I, involving, as Mike said, primarily Michiganders, the majority of them from the Detroit area. They were officially called the American North Russia Expeditionary Force. That was the official Army name for them. They were composed mainly of the 339th Infantry Regiment, along with some supporting companies and a battalion, 310th Engineers. But the 339th adopted this as their crest. Afterwards, we mentioned Cadillac. They borrowed the Marlettes from Cadillac's crest. A polar bear, and then the motto in Cyrillic says, "The bayonet decides." So this is a fitting story to be told. This is the 100th anniversary of World War I and the upcoming armistice. But in terms of being a centennial, the events that occurred 100 years ago for these gentlemen were just getting underway.
So this ran from September of 18 until June of 19.
Yes, September 4th, 1918 through roughly June 1st, 1919, right through the winter. Give you a little background. The Great War, it was triggered in June of 1914 when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated. That caused a cascading effect. Europe was a tinderbox at the time, and there were a lot of secret, not so secret, agreements among various countries to come to the other's aid. And when this thing started, the dominoes just kept falling, and eventually it turned into one of the bloodiest wars ever. The war itself actually got going in August of 1914. We are most familiar, because this is where most of the Americans fought, was the Western Front, which is roughly that red line there in northeastern France. There was a similar but much longer front called the Eastern Front that was manned by the Russian Tsar's Imperial Army. And you can see this little town up here in the far north of Russia, Archangel, long distance away from where all this other fighting was, but that's where these men from Michigan ultimately ended up. The war was between the Central Powers in the darker shade of color here. The Allied powers are represented by the light green colors, and the beige ones are the neutral countries who sat out the war. The story on how these men ended up in Russia begins with Tsar Nicholas II's abdication in March of 1917. There was a lot of unrest at the time in Russia. The peasants were tired of the living under the thumb of the Tsar and being used as cannon fodder on the Eastern Front. Socialist activity was running rampant, and in light of all that, the Tsar abdicated. March 15th, and a provisional government was formed that was under the direction of a gentleman named Nicholas Kerensky. Now, the U.S. tried to stay neutral, but that was very difficult. If we think there's polarization here today in this current age, it was every bit as bad in the years 1915, 1916, and early 1917. The government was officially trying to stay out of it, but certain events triggered our entry into the war, including a telegram from Germany to the Mexican ambassador. It was an German telegram. Don't have time to get into that, but that was what precipitated Congress declaring war on April 6, 1917, and we joined the side of the Allied powers, specifically Britain and France. So here's the Detroit Free Press, front page from that day. One little problem, though. We needed to draft some young men to form an army. At the time, our army was about 120,000 men, our standing army. That was all we had. That placed us that made us with the sixth largest army in the world, right after number 5, Belgium. So that gives you a feel, we weren't a big player in terms of the land forces in the U.S. Army. So they quickly had to draft young men to form this army. So they declared war in April, then on June 5th, 1917, in a single day, 10.5 million men registered for the draft. All men between the ages of 21 and 31, regardless of your health condition, regardless of whether you were a citizen, you were ordered to register for the draft sometime between 7 a.m. and 9 p.m. on June 5th. This ended up being basically a civic holiday, and one of the first holidays that was U.S.-wide. Very unusual in that most companies closed for the day, particularly if they employed a lot of young men. All the auto manufacturers in Detroit closed for the day. Ford Motor Company in particular said, if you're in that age range, when you come back tomorrow, you better have your receipt showing that you registered. If you don't have a job. If you were walking down the street after 9 p.m. on June 5th and didn't have that receipt, you were subject to arrest. There was a lot of unrest, particularly among the socialist elements. They were threatening to bring violence to these registration sites. The Spanish-American veterans stepped up and says, we'll protect them. So there's very little violence. The only violence that I can see in the newspaper recordings in Michigan occurred up in the Keweenaw Peninsula area. It wasn't too bad. It was minor. So this was a big day. This is where 10.5 million in the first draft were used to create our army that would end up going over to Europe. Now, where are we going to train these guys? We don't have the facilities to train them. So concurrent with all this activity, they're building cantonments to train. And there was generally one in each region. The one here from Michigan was in Battle Creek. Right over here, Camp Custer was the name, named after George Custer, a native of Monroe, Michigan. So the first division that was formed and trained there was called the Custer Division. That was the 85th Division of the Army, and they were activated on August 25th, 1917. This photo here was taken a little later. This is early July of 1918, just before the 85th Division shipped out. That's my grandfather right there. And I cropped the rest of it because there's 250 men in that photo. It's taken on one of those panorama.
Your grandfather, was he 18?
Well, he was 22 at the time. Most of these men that went were all born in 1895. So they were 22. My grandfather turned 23 while he was old. So now while they activated the 85th Division in August, the next step in the chain of events here is in November of 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrow the Kerensky government, which was provisional. They really never got their act together. The morale of the Imperial Army on the Eastern Front fell apart under the Kerensky government, and basically during 1917, the summer fighting season, there really wasn't much fighting occurring on the Eastern Front, which caused alarm to the French, British, and the Americans, because if they're not fighting, the Germans are going to move divisions from the eastern front to the western front. This little subhead, this is the Port Huron Times Herald, but an interesting little story here, Civil War now facing Russia. And that's a telling observation because that's exactly what happened. Now, this is our calendar, November, but the Russians use a different calendar. They call it the October Revolution because it occurred in late October of 1917. The Bolsheviks, once they came to power, had no stomach for continuing the fighting. They knew they didn't have the support of the Tsar's army, which had basically melted away. So they ended up negotiating a peace treaty with the Germans. Basically gave away large portions of what's today Poland and the Ukraine. And they signed that on March 3rd, 1918. So even though there wasn't much fighting going on, after March 3rd, that was the absolute end of fighting on the Eastern Front. And Germany had free rein to start moving their divisions west for the big push that they were planning on the Western Front for the spring and summer of 1918. Continuing now we're into the summertime. The 85th Division has been bringing in new recruits, new draftees, training them. My grandfather arrived right just before the 4th of July. I've got a postcard that he sent home, arrived safe and sound. He got about 2 weeks of basic training before they started moving the 85th Division out. It took them a full week from the 11th to the 17th. Took 70 trains to move the 30,000 men of the 85th Division from Battle Creek to New York. They stayed on Long Island at Camp Mills and then boarded troop transport ships in New York Harbor and set sail on the 22nd of July for Liverpool, England. While this is happening, while they're moving from Battle Creek to New York, President Wilson finally succumbs to the pressure that he's been getting from the British and French, wanting the U.S. to commit troops to a intervention in North Russia, a military intervention, to try and keep the Germans focused on the Eastern Front, to also try and protect military supplies that British and Americans have been sending to Archangel, which is a major port in the north, for the last 3 years to supply the Imperial Tsar's army. So there's all this war material up there, and they didn't want to fall in the hands of the Bolshevik or, even worse, the Germans. There was also the Czech Legion, which had been stranded. These were men who, now that the fight was over on the Eastern Front, they had been pressed into service in the Tsar's army, and they formed what they called the Czech Legion. Their problem was they wanted to go to the Western Front, but you couldn't go through Germany, so they were going to go across Siberia on the Trans-Siberia Railroad to the Pacific, board ships and come around to Africa and go to France. But they were stuck. They were battling their way against Bolshevik elements trying to get to the Pacific Ocean. So the thought was maybe we can bring them out through Archangel. And of course I mentioned the third point, keep German army divisions at the Eastern Front. So there was no act of Congress on this. There was no public statement on it. On July 17th, after listening to his diplomats, and against the advice of the generals, he went upstairs in the White House, typed up this memorandum on what he wanted them to do, and that's basically the instructions he gave his generals, why they were going to send American troops to North Russia. 6 days later, General Pershing decides that he's going to detach 4,750 men out of the 85th to form the American North Russia Expeditionary.
Mike, he was the Supreme Commander. What was his title?
But
that's basically
he was like
all American soldiers.
He was in charge of all American soldiers.
Thank you.
For the Western Front.
Excuse me.
So he makes this decision. I've seen the printed version of his diary. Apparently, he didn't make the decision that it would be the 339th. Someone else made that for him. He just approved it. A lot of people have speculated over the years, why did they pick the 339th? There were 4 infantry regiments in the 85th Division, 337, 338, 339, and 340. And they picked the 339th allegedly because, well, they were Michigan men and they were used to the cold and all this and the other thing. I can't see any of that in any of the writings. My conclusion is they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were on the troop transports, the next one's coming over on a convoy, and they would be landing in Liverpool just in time to make this happen before winter came. So they picked the 339th out of the 4 infantry regiments. The others ended up in France. They split the 310th Engineers in half and sent the 1st Battalion along with the 339th and pulled out an ambulance company and a field hospital company. So that comprised the American North Russia Expeditionary Force. Total of 4,750, another 500 came in late October. So the total that were up there for the winter was a little over 5,000. But this is all happening now during the summer in quick succession, summer of 1918. So these men are sent to a separate camp, the ones that are destined for North Russia. But they're not told they're going to North Russia, but they suspect something's up and they're ticked off. You know, they were drafted with the understanding they'd be fighting in France against the Hun, and they wanted to go to the Western Front. And it didn't look like they were going to, only that the rest of their 85th was. During the 3 weeks, the first 3 weeks of August, they're training in a camp about 20 miles outside of London. They're given new clothes, warmer clothes. Their rifles are taken away and they're given a Russian design rifle. And their machine guns were taken away and they were given British made Vickers and Lewis machine guns and told to learn how to use these. So eventually the word, after the second week, and the word got out that they were going to North Russia. Lieutenant Harry Meade found out, interestingly enough, on the streets of London during a day pass, because a lot of men could get a pass to go into London and do some sightseeing. So he's walking down the street, Whitehall, near the British War Office, and he sees a friendly face coming towards him. And the friendly face recognizes Harry. And Harry goes, Lowell, what are you doing here? And Lowell says, Harry, what are you doing here? And Harry says, well, I'm going to the Western Front. I'm with the 339th Infantry Regiment. Lowell says, well, I just came from the British War Office, and I heard that the 339th was headed to Russia. So that's how Harry Meade found out from Lowell Thomas. If that name rings a bell, that's because Lowell Thomas had just arrived back in London to report to the War Office on the status of the fighting in Saudi Arabia being led by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. The two knew each other because Harry grew up in Valparaiso, Indiana, and at the time his parents rented out the upstairs room, and one of the students that they happened to have rented it to 7 years earlier was Lowell Thomas. So a week later now, August 25th, all these men are aboard troop transports. They headed to Archangel. They arrived on actually they arrived on the 4th, spent overnight aboard the ships and started disembarking on the 5th. Okay, once they get there, they were also told, and they knew this, that they were going to be under British command. That began a month or two earlier when President Wilson ordered the commander of the USS Olympia, which had been Dewey's flagship. They sent that to the waters in the Arctic Ocean off of Murmansk and placed them under British command as well. So when the soldiers arrived and their officers were told by the British, well, there's no war material for you to protect. Sorry about that. The Bolsheviks took it all. So we want you to go chase them. And they ordered them to go down the railroad front to the south and down the Dvinia River front to the southeast to chase the fleeing Volos, as they called them. That was the Americans' nickname for the Bolsheviks. And they were ordered to fight alongside Canadian, French, and White Russian troops. White Russian troops were those who were not so much socialist as the Red Bolsheviks, and many of them were veterans of the Tsar's Imperial Army. So this is the typical mission, creepifying. Your initial orders only survive until you actually arrive, and instead of being like a humanitarian mission, these guys get thrown into the brunt of the fighting immediately upon arrival. The shaded area here is the extent Allied-held territory. And it's about 250 miles, almost 300 miles down to this point right here. That occurred midwinter. By Christmas, New Year's, that was the maximum extent. 100 years ago this week, actually, Lieutenant Harry Meade and his 42 men were just south of that shaded area. That was the furthest south any groups of the Americans or British had penetrated into North Russia, but the location was very dicey. They didn't think they could hold that for any period of time, so they withdrew to Ust-Danga, where they stayed then from October on into January. So that's where Harry Meade was 100 years ago. Rodovino, I think is how you pronounce that little village. 100 years ago, my grandfather was right about there. They hadn't got to the furthest point south yet on the railroad front. He was in Company I, which was on the railroad front. Company A, with Lieutenant Harry Meade, was on the river front.
You're still 300 or 400 miles north of Moscow, right?
Oh, yeah. Moscow is 600 miles south.
600 miles, wow.
And this is about, only halfway, about 300 miles right here. So
Wow.
long ways from Moscow.
Yeah.
Petrograd was the capital.
Yeah, Petrograd's over
Thank you.
here, in
That's
this
pretty cool.
area here. So now November 11th, everybody's celebrating the end of the war. This is downtown Woodward. You see Hudson's in the background. But the war was over for most, but not all. My focus isn't so much on the battles, on where these guys fought. That's included in books like this in greater detail. Lieutenant Harry Meade is one of the 3 authors of this book, American Expedition Fighting the Bolsheviki, that was published in 1920. But some of the major battles, for example, in Tulgas on November 11th, that was, at the time, the sharpest and bloodiest battle that they had engaged in the first 2 months. That was on the riverfront. I mentioned Ust-Danga. That's right next to Nizhny Gora and Vysoka Gora. That was the turning point of the Allied intervention, because on January 19th through the 22nd, the Bolsheviks attacked and forced them to withdraw to Shankhurst. And it was quite a large loss of life in that particular battle. I mentioned the railroad front. Those battles occurred September through October. And the last battle that was fought was in early April of 1919 on the Onega front at Bolsheviks, and it ended basically in a stalemate because a warm front came through, and the snow started to melt, and you can't move men and artillery in slush and mud. So both sides retreated from April through May. There was very little fighting. This is a typical kit worn by the Americans up there. Walter Street was with Company M of the 339th Infantry. Here's some scenes that were of what Archangel looked like back in 1918. This is snow on the ground here, but these are government buildings here, Russian government buildings. Statue of Peter the Great. This is the main drag today called, or back then it was given a different name. In the succeeding years it was renamed Troitsky Prospect. Russian Orthodox Cathedral back on the riverfront, and you can see some of the dockyards here. And then on the opposite side of the Dvinia were the major dockyards, because the river was too wide to put a bridge, so you took ferries across to get to Archangel. The railroad ended on the opposite side of the river back here. There's a street level scene in that particular area. This building is the Allied headquarters, and you can see they had streetcars down that main street, but you still see here, this is the Russian pony cart, which hauled almost all the war material up there, whether there was snow on the ground or not. The interesting thing was, when the Americans arrived, the British said, the streetcar workers have gone on strike. Do you have anybody in the 339th that knows how to operate streetcars? And there were some DUR men, and they were pressed into service to break the strike. It took 5 days, but eventually the workers came back. since they were under British command, they had to do what they were told. They didn't like being used as strikebreakers, but they didn't have a choice. Some of the equipment that they were given, they quickly found was insufficient. The gloves weren't the best. The boots were terrible. They were all British issues, so many of the men bought gloves that were locally made. And here's an American soldier purchasing gloves in Archangel, an outdoor market.
Were the residents of this town pro-Tsar?
It's interesting. It was because of the Bolsheviks taking over. All the ambassadors and envoys in Moscow all fled to the north, and they brought large numbers of people with them. So the population of Archangel roughly doubled prior to the arrival of the Americans in September. But I have read a book that's been translated in English that discussed what the mood was in August when the British first arrived through the time when it was announced that the Americans were coming. And the locals in Archangel were sitting on the fence. The British wanted them to stage a bloodless coup and urged the Bolsheviks, the few Bolsheviks that were in town, to get the message and leave. And they knew they could pull that off, but they didn't want to sign up to do that just with the British. They distrusted the British, but according to this book, this gentleman that wrote it was a adjutant general in the Imperial Army and agreed to work for the white forces in Archangel. And he said the mood immediately changed in Archangel as soon as it was announced that the Americans were on the way, because you could trust the Americans.
Wasn't Admiral Kolchak's headquarters in Archangel as well? That Russian name.
Kolchak was further east by the Urals.
Yeah.
So at this time, no, he was not there. But this government, the provisional government and the adjutant general that I mentioned, they were in close communication with Kolchak and his provisional government. And the Archangel government that they were going to form that would be pro-Allied was linked closely with Kolchak and his forces and his government by phone and courier and things like that. These are some scenes here. It's a little hard to tell, but that's a biplane right there. And that tent is the hangar. And one of the men of the Free Tent Engineers, his job, this is one of his diaries that's out at the Bicknell Historical Library. He describes how he had a civilian crew and their job was to keep the snow from collapsing the tent that was used as a hangar for the British biplanes. I mentioned that there was no bridge over the Davinia River. Once the ice froze, you could walk across. They would also lay streetcar tracks across, a light railroad track during the winter. But the Nenets people, they're closely related to the Eskimos. They're further to the northeast of Archangel. They would bring their reindeer and sleds in during the winter and provide taxi service and make some good money during the winter. So there's an American soldier getting ready to take a ride in a reindeer sled. And that's that same Russian Orthodox cathedral that you saw in the earlier photo. There's a couple of photos taken on the riverfront November 15th. You can see the snows there. The first snows hit the third week of October. They had light snow occasionally before that, but the first snows, measurable amount that stuck, occurred third week of October. And the men on the riverfront still hadn't gotten their winter coats. That had all been packed in duffels that were stored deep in the holds of those ships. So when they were told to go chase the bubbles, they had to leave their cold weather gear behind. So it took until the third week of October when the first snows really hit for them to get their warm clothing. Bolsheviks took all the good rolling stock with them down the riverfront, and they left behind some old rusty wood-burning locomotives that the engineers had to retrofit to get working again. So these guys all posed climbing on the front of that locomotive. You can hardly see it. I mentioned the ponies, Russian pony. This is a convoy, supply convoy. This was in January 1919 on the Davinia riverfront, taking supplies to the men at the farthest end of the front lines. The men, particularly on the riverfront, complained about not getting enough food. On average, 1/3 of the amount of food and supplies that started out from Archangel would get pilfered and resold on the black market. So they're only getting 2/3 of the calories they should have. It's bitter cold out, so they had to supplement by shooting game, local game, and also bartering with the peasants for potatoes, root vegetables, things like that comprise their daily diet. 310th Engineers built many wooden block houses that were used by the men to barricade themselves in when they were attacked, with ports here so they could fire outside. And they were bomb-proofed in the sense that they had a little cellar underneath that where they could go if it really got bad in an artillery bombardment. Here's a photo of Harry Meade. I'm going to digress a little more here at this point. Discuss a little more about Lieutenant Harry Meade. He was Company A, 339th Infantry Regiment. Can you tell me who's on either side of him in that photo? See, I don't know either, but we do know him.
He did like the ladies.
So it's not necessarily your grandmother, huh?
See, I don't know whether that was taken in Russia or if it was in Detroit or Battle Creek. There was no caption that comes with it, but we do know that's him. Whoops, hit the wrong one. Let me read just a little bit here. This is from a 1959 article that appeared in the Detroit News titled "Inch from Death, in Memory of Russia." And it was generated because there was a magazine article in the American Heritage magazine that had been published just a month earlier. So they wanted to interview Harry Meade for this. And that article in the American Heritage told of how Harry Meade and his 42-man company, Company A, were holding Ninjagora, a small little village, when they were attacked on January 19, 1919, by 800 Bolsheviks who were all dressed in white smocks. They blended in so good with the snowfields that it was a complete surprise. It ended up hand-to-hand fighting, bayonets, grenades, close-in fighting, which was unusual in North Russia. There were only a few instances of that. This was one of them. And Harry said that upon the attack, I went behind a building to reload my pistol and then started to run in back of the buildings on Main Street. And as I started around one of the wood huts, I hesitated. For what reason, I'll never know, but the sudden stop saved my life. Because just then, a Russian who looked to be about at least 10 feet tall lunged at me with his bayonet and missed me by an inch. I emptied my pistol into him and continued running. In order to get back to the rear positions in this village and get back to safety as a retreat, they had to go down a ravine and then up a hill. And even today, photos show that there's no forest, no trees or nothing. This is all open field. The ravine is just a low area, so there's absolutely no cover for them. And they couldn't run very fast because the snow was up to their shoulders down in this ravine, and it was way too soft for them and made them sitting ducks for the Russians who now held the village at the top of the bluff. Only 47 men in the of the 47 men in the company, only 7 men got back to Schenker's, which is the town to the north. And so when you compute the numbers, that means 28 men in this retreat were killed or missing in action out of the 42, and 14 were wounded, and 7 were unscathed. So this was this was the largest single day, actually over 2 day loss in that entire intervention up there. Harry wasn't wounded then, but he was wounded later on and then eventually evacuated to a hospital. So he did receive what was the equivalent of the Purple Heart back then. There's the wound chevron, which is on his sleeve, and when the Purple Heart was reinstated in 1933, they could apply for the Purple Heart in terms of the wound chevron. So that's Harry's story, an abbreviated version of it in North Russia, but then he was active in later years with the Polar Bear Association. Like I said, he helped write that book. And in 1936, he was president of the Polar Bear Association of Veterans. And this is a photo taken on April 24th, 1936. He's alongside the president of the Detroit City Council, John Smith, and they're accepting the stuffed polar bear, which has been killed in a little brawl. at the Detroit Zoo on February 6, 1935. The bear's name was Cincy. We call him Sasha these days. He's traveled around for a long time. He was in the 339th Army National Guard on Grosse Pointe at their building, and he has since now been moved to the Michigan Heroes Museum up in Frankenmuth. The bear's in the lobby. So when you walk right in, you're staring right in. Sasha, formerly known as Cincy.
Is he still in that glass case?
Still in the glass case.
Oh, very cool.
There's Hudson Meade, his son, there on the left. This was taken in May of 2007. That's Merle Coleman. His father was Cleo Coburn, and that's Richard Patching, son of Robert Patching. All three are sons of polar bears. And so that's the first chance I had to meet Hudson was on that day. Took some photos. He brought his books of photos and reading programs. And told me the story about the meeting in London with Old Thomas. I went through the database at the Bicknell Historical Library, and this is not an all-inclusive list, but based on the information they've collected over the years from the items in their collection, items that have been published elsewhere. These men at one time had lived in one of the Grosse Pointes. And surprisingly, for such a small company as the 337th, they are overrepresented in this list.
Mike, there was one more person here that had a father who was in the polar bears. Who was it again? Who was your father?
My dad was in the 310th Engineer.
Okay, so he was not
They
from
built the
Grosse Pointe.
blockhouses
Okay.
in our
Okay.
My grandfather was, but he was living in Detroit.
He was not from Grosse Pointe. Okay, thank you.
So like I said, this is not an all-inclusive list. It's just a quick search through the archives that the Bentley has online. I'd say it contains about 90% of the men. There is no official roster of polar bears. Army didn't start keeping roster information until just before World War II. So what we have to rely on are things like this. Plus I found out recently Ancestry has online the passenger ship, the troop transport passenger lists. So knowing which companies went over there, I'm able to find a very good list that includes next of kin. So I'm working on trying to turn that into a database that could be searchable, but that's going to be a bit of a project to get 4,700, almost 5,000 men. But I'm able to check against that. When I come up with a name that I can't find with the Bentley, then I go to the passenger ship list. This photo was taken on February 4th, 1919 at the railroad front. There's a blockhouse in the background there, and the soldiers walking through the snow trench on his sentry duty. The night before, the photo caption says the temperature had gone down to 40 below zero. There are a few occasions where they had 50 below zero temperatures. When you're out in the forest, the men were often startled during the night, which was very long, by what they thought were gunshots, but it would turn out to be the branches on the trees shattering from the intense cold. It sounded just like the crack of a rifle.
So they'd have like 16 hours of darkness.
Yeah, they got about 3 to 4 hours of dawn, dusk, and daylight in December.
Yeah.
They're 135 miles south of the Arctic Circle. And so they did get a little bit of daylight, but it was a long night. That was very depressing. There were a number of psychological problems, including one suicide, just from being in that sort of an environment that you're not used to, where it's dark almost the entire time for weeks on end. The total losses in North Russia, there were 152 that were either killed in action or died from their wounds. 72 men died from disease, primarily.
It's little wonder that 72 died from disease.
Yeah.
My dad said that he saw temperatures as low as 80 below zero Fahrenheit. Can you imagine
No.
surviving in temperatures like this?
Yeah.
Incredible. And they weren't even dressed properly.
Right.
Thanks, wait a minute, thanks to the British, because the British were in charge of the polar bears. My father said if the Americans had been in charge, they would have known in November that the war was over. And the British forgot to tell them.
That's right.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is, looking through the American records, the American medical records, I can find only, they quantified how many men were hospitalized for frostbite. Want to take a guess on what that number was?
Sure.
29. That's unbelievably low.
Yeah.
Okay, so those had to be the worst of the worst cases. We know from subsequent correspondence among the Polar Bear Association, if there were reunions, they would make a list of who's in the hospital. You know, and into the 30s, these guys were still hospitalized for amputations, caused by frostbite, all kinds of infirmities.
My father had pneumonia, and the doctor gave him a bottle of bourbon, and he said, "Good luck." And that was it.
Wow.
The lucky ones that came down with the Spanish influenza didn't progress to the point where it was pneumonia, but these 72 that died, 60 of them died in the first month from the Spanish influenza and or the complications from it. The lucky ones that had it were the ones that got sent on a barge up the river or in a car on a railroad track because they got away from the rustic conditions of the hospital the hospitals in Archangel. That just spread the disease and made it even worse. There were 7 that died from accidents, including 1 suicide, and at least 305 were wounded. Those records weren't kept the best, but the numbers there you see, other than the wounded, are pretty accurate. So now the war's over, a long time in the U.S., everybody's trying to get back to peacetime, but for the people in Michigan, they know their sons are still over in North Russia. They're getting their mail. Usually it took about 6 weeks to get mail exchanged back and forth. So they know that the conditions aren't the best up there. There's threatening mutinies, things like that. So rallies were held in Grand Rapids and also Detroit the first week of February to get people to sign petitions, petitioning Congress to bring our boys home. And they did have the desired effect, whether it was just coincidental or not, but 3 weeks later the War Department announced that they would be withdrawn at the earliest opportunity. They didn't promise a date, but they knew, as most everybody else knew, they weren't coming out until the ice melted on the rivers and they could get troop transports up there. And basically that meant June 1st, because that's when the first ship departed for the U.S. So June 1st, first ship sailed. The men went to Camp Pontonizan in Brest, France, where they went through additional delousing. They had delousing before they left Archangel, but this time they took all their equipment, burned it, issued them all new equipment, new helmets, new rifles, and uniforms. And after 4 days roughly, they boarded luxurious ocean liners to come back to the United States. And they really were. It was the President Grant had been a very nice, and the guys just loved it because they would get U.S. food now from U.S. Navy mess cooks. They had a program with entertainment. So that was the highlight, was the trip from France back to the United States.
Startling how thin everybody was.
Yes, they were fit. When you look at the photos up close, they're bronzed, they're lean, they've been out exposed to the elements for all those months, so they were nice and suntan. It was on the way home, though, that they called themselves the Polar Bears. A bit of an interesting story there. Before the ship sailed on June 1st, 2 weeks earlier, General Stewart, who was in command of the Americans, cabled General Pershing, who was in Paris, asking for permission for the American North Russia Expeditionary Force to wear a polar bear patch on their left shoulder. And the men wholeheartedly agreed with that. That's what they wanted, and so he agreed. But they were slow in getting the approval back to Archangel, so when the first ship left on June 1st, it was still up in the air. They heard nothing more for a few days. Now they're getting close to France, and they're trying to decide, what are we gonna do? When we get to the camp there, we wanna wear a patch to show we were in Russia. So they formed a little committee to come up with a prototype of what the patch would look like, because the cable just said this would be a white polar bear on a blue background. So they assigned one guy to sew one up, and he admitted in his diary, I was no artist. He says, I couldn't draw a polar bear if I tried. And everybody agreed with him. You know, we're not going to wear that thing. So they decided, since they hadn't heard anything and they didn't know whether it was going to be approved or not, they came up with an alternate, which is what you see on Harry Mead's shoulder here, NR, with the N and the R, the legs commingled. And so then agreed, yeah, that's okay. So they whipped those up on board the ship, and that's what the first group of men wore when they landed in Camp Pontonese. But eventually then they quickly found out it had been approved. So most of the men that came on that first ship then back to the U.S. stayed with the NR, but that was not popular at all because the guys on board the ship stole that little icon from a patent medicine called Nature's Remedy. Little number 9 pills. They thought that wasn't what they wanted, so they were glad, but as you see, many of them just never bothered to take the NR patch off. So you see a variety of those patches on the surviving uniforms. The first group arrived back then on Detroit on July 3rd. So they had left Archangel on June 1st, and the trains pulled in at Michigan Central Station. The first section was at 7:30 in the evening of the 3rd. They were allowed to go home with friends or family or get a room downtown, but they had to be back at Michigan Central Station at 8 a.m. The next morning, so they could take a steamer to Belle Isle, where they had a parade and welcoming picnic for the first group of men to come back. And this is the group, the throng that they saw as they came down the gangplank of the ferry when they got onto Belle Isle. So that was July 4th, 1990.
Is that a polar bear on its hind legs?
Yep, the local welcoming committee came up with that one.
Yeah.
They knew they were going to be polar bears, so that's a little awkward. But
That's weird.
They had a big shindig, and speeches, and they marched, they paraded down Central Avenue, speeches at the casino. So it was a big event. I've got a photograph of my grandfather. He's wearing the white armband that they were all issued that had a polar bear on it. Now, the other thing was we weren't able to bring all the war dead home with them in 1919. They got 105 brought back out of the 230 total. When the Graves Registration Unit had to leave quickly in September of 1919 because of a threatened Bolshevik attack that didn't actually materialize. So the Polar Bear Association of Veterans was formed in 1920 with the primary objective to get the rest of their war dead back. And it took them until 1929 before a search party was allowed to return to North Russia to conduct a survey of the areas where these men had been buried, and they eventually found the remains of 86 more American soldiers. And the reason for such a long time going between 1919 and 1929, we didn't have diplomatic relations with Russia. So it had to be done through intermediaries, and the Soviets always insisted, you want your bodies, you send us X number of shiploads a week. And they weren't going to be bribed on that. So nothing happened until the governor of Michigan legislature appropriated some money in 1929 and got the Veterans of Foreign Wars to lead this search party that went back. And they dressed in civilian clothes so they wouldn't stand out. And they were successful in getting 86. But there were still a large number that they couldn't recover. Another 14 were recovered in 1934, which leaves, depending upon the shoddy record keeping, 22 or 23 bodies still in North Russia, out of which only 17 at the most could be recoverable. The rest were drowned and swept downstream, things like that. So there's still at least 17 or more that were recorded on index cards as a known location as being buried. But when they went back in 1929, they could not find them. On Memorial Day then, 1930, after they brought back these 86 bodies, 44 of them were reburied at Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy. That was the day that the Polar Bear Monument was dedicated, and these 44 were buried in a oblong circle surrounding the monument. And this was a significant event. There was an estimated 10,000 people there. This is out in the sticks back in 1930. Cars were lined up and down, parked along Crooks Road and along Lake Road. You can see in the background loudspeakers. WJR broadcast live. The governor spoke.
Would that be parents, do you think?
Yeah, I could elaborate.
That's right.
We know these are the parents of a fellow first name Ignishinsky. They're immigrants, obviously, and that's their son's coffin. You can see Boy Scouts in the background. It was a big event. That's the monument that was dedicated that day. You can see it if you know where to look if you're on I-75. It's actually closer to the Crooks side of the cemetery. Right, not too far from the big building, the Temple of Memories. We continue to have a Memorial Day ceremony for them. That was the tradition they started on May 30th, 1930, after they passed away. Stan Bozich, who founded the Michigan Heritage Museum, he had befriended many of the last survivors in the late 1970s, and he would organize their reunions for them, which were always held in the even years. And he promised them that he would keep that tradition going. So Stan Bozich formed the Polar Bear Memorial Association and started contacting relatives of the polar bear to have them come out on Memorial Day. So there were a few years there in the 1980s where it was just Stan and his brother there, but they had a small ceremony for them. Now we get 200, sometimes 300 people, depending upon the weather. So we have a sizable crowd every Memorial Day at 11 a.m. Public's invited. So as president of the Polar Bear Memorial Association, that's my job to make sure that happens. And we organize it in conjunction with Whitechapel. They arrange for the flyover of the A-10s from Selfridge. We get the group out of Fraser, Army Reserve Group, the successors to the 239. They got reorganized about 10 years ago. But they come out and support us with a rifle squad, color guard, and a bugle. So that concludes my story of the polar bears. If you're interested, additional resources, like I said, the Lincoln Heroes Museum, founded by Stan Bozich. We've got the stories of almost 50 polar bears. The story consists of uniform, medals, and a biography. U of M Bentley Historical Library on the North Campus at U of M in Ann Arbor has a large collection. Many of their holdings are diaries, letters, maps, the blue line drawings that were brought back by the 310th engineers, showing the machine gun emplacements, the blockhouses they built, the bridges they rebuilt. The blue lines are just like perfect, like the day they rolled them up. I've unrolled them, I've used them, I took digital photos, uploaded them to my web server so my friend in Archangel could download them. His hobby is, he's a Russian Civil War buff, and he does military archaeology. And he's built a base camp at the front lines, where the front lines were on the railroad front. So I was able to help him. And he says, yes, that stuff is there, but it's like a military city. The British built and expanded it after the Americans left in June. The British were there until the following September, and they expanded greatly on that. The Sandusky District Library in the Thumb, they've got a large online collection of information, photos, and diaries that were submitted by San Juan County polar bears. And I've got a website that we've been maintaining for a little while. So
Mike, there's 56 buried at Whitechapel.
it's 56 now because later on there were additional burials, like from the 1934, and then there were others that had been buried in 1919 that has to be moved over to Whitechapel. Now, surrounding the monument are the graves of a lot of the polar bear veterans who bought lots then after the monument was dedicated in 1930. So a lot of polar bears are buried out there, including Stan Bozich. He was named an honorary polar bear at one of their last reunions. They gave him a certificate. Robert Plunkett signed it. If you've heard of the Plunkett Cooney Law Firm in Detroit, that's Robert Plunkett's name on that law firm. And he was president in 1980 and signed that certificate for Stan. So Stan passed away last week. His funeral was Friday, and they buried him right in front and just outside the cement walkway that surrounds the Polar Bear Monument.
Any questions? Oh, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yes, yeah, you got a question?
Please. Why was Whitechapel chosen? Did you say that, or?
Whitechapel was new in 1928, I believe. That's when they started it. It was one of the first garden memorial park type cemeteries in the country.
Right.
So all the grave markers are going to be flat, and they would have ornamental statuary and flowers and everything else. So there was a VFW polar bear post in Detroit, and they linked up with the owners of Whitechapel. Whitechapel offered the space, and then in return, the polar bear veterans got other polar bears to sign up to buy plots surrounding it. So it was like one hand helping the other. That's how that came about. And then that cemetery has since expanded greatly since it was in 1930, further to the south.
Who paid for the statue?
That's not real clear to me.
Okay.
Certainly Whitechapel owns it now. I believe the funds were all raised by the polar bears. I just can't find a record of it and what they paid, but it was carved by sculptor Leon Vermont, who was in Minneapolis. And it's a nice piece of work. It's a nice piece of art. And that's a reproduction of it there in this little badge thing. But I had the opportunity to go to Archangel this past August. I just thought you might like to see a few photos. This is our little group disembarking from the railroad at first 445, basically the front lines. There's no station there, but you can arrange with them. They'll drop you off at any mile marker. And mile marker in Russia would be a verst. A verst is a unit of measurement equal to about 2/3 of a mile. So, they just let us off right there. There's no platform.
You didn't go in January?
No. Didn't go in June either because the mosquitoes are terrible in June.
Mosquitoes, there you go.
They advise coming in August,
Okay.
not in July. So they let you off and then they continue on towards Vologda. And getting off isn't hard. Getting back on is. And you can see that's the bottom step right there.
Wow.
And the ties are back here. You can't step on the tie. You're stepping on this downward slope of crushed ballast. So that first step getting back on, you need help. My friend Alexei, he does this all the time. You should see the backpack he carries. It's 2 feet taller than him. So he throws the backpack up first, and he's the last man in. He helps everybody else with the push to get back. That's one of the trenches near the railroad front, about a quarter mile west of the railroad. You can still see it today. A lot of leaves and stuff have filled it in, but it's still visible. You'll still see barbed wire entanglements. It's just as it was left back in September of 1990. That's me standing in that trench. So you can see it's about up to my knees, but it was certainly a lot deeper when it was originally built. And this is one of the ladies that was there to help interpret. She's getting ready to get on her knees and then crawl into the basement of a blockhouse. The blockhouse is gone, but this was created by actually the Bolsheviks and then captured by the Allies, the Americans, and then used as a bomb-proof or an artillery-proof shelter. And that's what it looks like inside.
Jeez. I guess it's better getting shot, but it sure doesn't look like much. Boy.
Yeah, not much, but at least you knew you'd have a chance to survive an artillery barrage. That's Alexei there with his metal detector, and he's holding a piece of shrapnel, I believe, that he just found. Every foot in this particular area, which was subjected to intense heavy artillery bombardment, you'll find shrapnel. You don't have to go very far. The gentleman that's standing, that's John Yap. He's the son of Herman Yap from Company M. And John is in his mid-70s. I'm a grandson. I'm in my late 60s. John says his father remarried late in life, and his father was like 53 or 55 when he was born. So he's one of the youngest sons of a polar bear. And his father was from Paducah, Kentucky. He lives in the Louisville area and joined me. He had planned to go in September on his own. He found out I was going in August. They moved their dates around, joined up with us. So that's Alexi on the right, John using the metal detector, and the lady in black, that's our interpreter, Evgenia. Did a tremendous job, fantastic lady. Usually you have to go a sentence at a time, and then she translates. You can go 3-4 minutes, and she'd remember it by just jotting 1 or 2 words down. And then she'd repeat it back out in the other language. That's his base camp in the background, log cabins for shelter. It's out in the middle of nowhere. You don't ask permission, because if you ask permission to build something, nobody will take the risk of saying yes or no. So you just do it. He also built the Russian Orthodox chapel there, because they found the remains of some Bolshevik soldiers, which they reburied and then had consecrated by the Russian Orthodox bishop, Archangel. He came out on the train.
Kind of interesting because they were militantly anti-religious.
The Bolsheviks were,
Yeah.
But the population today is not. The Russian Orthodox Church is flourishing. They're rebuilding all the ones that have been torn down by the Bolsheviks. And that's Alexi and me. Alexi's kind of short compared to me, so I was stooping a little and he was on his tiptoes. That was the last picture we took. But that was the picture from outside my hotel on the Divinia riverfront in Archangel. Sunset, when I was there that first week, was about 9:30 and it was back up by 3 a.m. But now they've got less daylight than we do. It changes very rapidly. The sunsets are fantastic at that latitude, at that time of year. So that's all I have. Any questions?
Questions? Before you go, Mike, tell us a little bit more about your museum and how large it is and what it encompasses.
Sure. Museum is 40 years old. We were first incorporated by Stan Bozich back in 1978. In Royal Oak, he was a Royal Oak fireman, and he borrowed a room upstairs at the fire station for his collection of militaria. He was a Navy veteran, Korean era, but he was a young teenager when all the World War I vets started returning home, and he collected a lot of their stuff, and that's how he got hooked. Eventually he found some of these polar bears and started helping them with their reunions. His collection grew, and eventually he acquired a place in Frankenmuth, because at the time, and still today, that's when they had the largest number of tourists in Michigan each year. So he founded his museum up there in 1982 and rented quarters. 1989, they built a new museum on White Street, just north of Bronner's. And we've been there since then. We've expanded once. And we've got 7 galleries. We've got the World War I gallery, half of which is devoted to the polar bears. And we've got a World War II gallery, a Korean gallery. We've got Space Gallery for all the space pioneers, including the astronauts from Michigan. And we've got a cross gallery for Distinguished Service Cross, Navy Cross, Air Cross. That's where my grandfather's at. He was a Distinguished Service Cross, so his display is over there instead of the polar bears. And last but not least is the Medal of Honor Gallery. We have 30 Medal of Honor recipients from Michigan who have donated, or their family has donated their Medal of Honor to the museum, and we tell their story there. That's the largest single collection of Medal of Honors you can find anywhere. More so than the Medal of Honor Society, more than the Smithsonian and any other place. We've got the story starting with, we have one actually from the Civil War. It comes very frequently in the Civil War, but beginning of World War I, it became much tougher to be put up for it, much less received. So we're open 7 days a week. We tell the stories of the veterans. We're not a hardware museum, although you will see some hardware, but that's tucked away on top of the display cases or in the corners. We tell the stories of the Michigan men and women who fought in various wars. the beginning, not too much the Civil War, the beginning of Spanish-American War and World War I. So
Very good.
if you're up that way, please stop in. We've been sponsoring Frank Becksman's show on Friday mornings the last half hour, telling the stories of hometown heroes in conjunction with the portion of the Lions game next day, which is sponsored by Applebee's. But one of our board members arranges that for Applebee's as well, so that's why we tied in with WJR. So we're getting our name known a little more down in southeast Michigan because the last 40 years it's primarily been seen as a Franken museum. Hopefully we'll spread the word a little more now here that we're more visible. We changed our name to make it easier. We were called Michigan's Military and Space Heroes Museum, but that's a lot of words. We think Michigan Heroes Museum is easier to say, easier to remember, and still conveys the same message.
Great, thank you.
And I'm on the board too also.
Any other questions, especially the students, if you've got anything? Please.
Can you give us some information about joining the Polar Bear Memorial Association?
Come at 11 a.m. on Memorial Day, and we've got a slip of paper there that we can get your name and address, get you on the mailing list, or you can take my business card and email me. I'll get you on the mailing list. To keep ourselves funded so we can buy the wreaths and the mailing list, we just ask for a voluntary $10 donation per family. That's how we keep going. We operate under the museum's 501c3, so it is tax deductible if you're able to do that. But that's why we're affiliated with the museum. But yeah, we welcome anybody and everybody on Memorial Day.
Great, anything else? Very good, thank you so much.
Thank you.